Good day everyone, I am Lauren Jane Canyubo, taking up Bachelor of Science in Forestry and also Bayawan Santa Catalina campus from the College of Agriculture and Forestry. For today's, I am going to discuss about the history of the Philippines forestry, which is all about the history of forest policy in the Philippines. The history of forest policy in the Philippines can be divided into four main periods. This period, first, is a period of low exploitation during colonial, wartime, and post-war eras. Second, a period of increased exploitation for development during the post-independence era. Third, a peak of logging and concession exploitation during the 1960s and 1970s. And the last is one of building a forest products in the industry in the 1970s and 1980s. The first period of low exploitation during colonial, wartime, and post-war eras, the first period was largely dominated by Spanish royal decrees which focused on gaining revenue and keeping the Spanish Navy supplied with timber. The population was small and thus pressure on the timber resource was limited. In the year 1898, the country was taken over the United States, and in the year 1904, the American Congress enacted the first Forest Act. This was to form the basis of forestry legislation until the 1975. The second period, a period of increased exploitation for development during the post-independence era. This is all about the second period coincided with independence in the year 1946, a need to develop the country and its economy. The new constitution provided that all timberlands belonged to the state. Forest policy did not change much, but greater emphasis was placed on the production of timber. This meant more revenue to the government, much needed to accelerate its development. This period also saw the change to modern mechanized technology, and hence the ability to have a measured impact on the forest over a large area. Also introduced was the application of selective logging of the dipterocarp forest. Prior to this development, logging occurred without much concern for any future harvest from the forest. Third period, a peak of logging and concession exploitation during the 1960s and 1970s. The third period, was peak period of exploitation of the Philippine forest. Starting in the early 1960s, harvest from the forest rose rapidly with little concern for long-term sustainability of this harvest. The impetus for this rush to destruction came from three sources. The large multinational logging companies were able to make enormous profits from the continued growth of harvesting volumes, often in association with local business people. The almost insatiable demand for logs from Japan in particular, and the government also took in pride in the ever-increasing harvest, which meant more foreign exchange and increasing revenue. By 1969, forest products constituted 33% of total export revenues, while at the same time, local and international foresters were warning of the inevitability of the forest diminishing if there was not a significant change in policy. Ironically, much of the revenue was being used to provide agricultural lands for rural populations who had no other way of making a living. And the last is one of building a forest products in the industry in the 1970s and 1980s. The fourth period saw a move towards local forest products industry during the 1960s and 1970s. As much as 80% of the recorded log production was exported as logs processing into lumber, and plywood was almost seen as residue industry. In 1975, the government began a rationalization program for the industry, part of which required concession holders to do some processing. The other major component was a ban on lag exports. These two components had what, hindsight, was a predictable effect. A number of small, generally inefficient mills were built and grossly underutilized simply to continue with the new rules, while at the same time the companies continued with what they were good at, and which was very profitable exporting lags. In the year 1979, a further attempt at restricting unprocessed lag exports was made, with similar effect, and again in 1980, a proposed total lag export ban was postponed indefinitely. It is said that large-scale graft and corruption in the public sector contributed a great deal to the failure of attempts to control the harvest of the forest and the subsequent processing of lags. The exemplify this was the banning of logging in three regions in the year 1985, which should have resulted in saving about 500,000 meter cube of timber for the next 2 years' harvest. It is generally believed that the savings did not materialize because of rampant timber smuggling in the banned areas. Current forest policy. A major turning point in the history of the country and a forest policy was the democratic elections held in 1986, and the end of martial law and, presidential decrees which had dominated life and policy development. Resource tenure. Many of the problems associated with the past large-scale destruction of the forest resource can to some extent be traced back to a combination of land and concession tenure issues and lack of ability or will to enforce the requirements of the concessions. In the situation where a short-term concession is held or there is the long-term security of tenure to land, there exists a clear economic signal to extract as much benefit as possible in the shortest time possible for the least cost and to ensure no long-term obligations are entered into. This was exactly the case in the Philippines, where the government held title to all forest land, or effectively by decree, and was open to the graft and corruption which reportedly became rampant prior to the elections in the year 1986. Rural land users had no title and thus lacked any incentive to consider the long-term sustainable output from the site. In fact, to exacerbate matters, they were not permitted to make commercial use of the wood and non-wood forest products, except with permission from the government. From this, it is evident that, in common with many other countries, there is an urgent need to address the issue of land tenure in relation to the rural people and their rights to use the land and forest resources. Much of the post-1986 policy development has been developed with this matter in mind, with ongoing reforms to tenure issues with consent from government, private individuals, and entities may use forest land for traditional forestry purposes, pasture, agriculture, and other pursuits. Other short-term permits and other term leases, upland areas occupancy is legitimized through issuance of certificates of stewardship contracts or the CSC, which grant a 25-year tenure renewable to 50 years. The grantees can receive assistance in agroforestry development and are encouraged to plant trees on at least 20% of the land they occupy. Licenses to exploit natural forests are covered by 25-year timberless agreements, designed to encourage greater compliance with the requirements of the license. These terms include the requirement to replant some areas and trees following harvest for a subsequent crop from the land. The Forest Development, a Master Plan for Forest Development, or the MPFD, and formulated in the year 1990 a new set of regulations including a draft of the Forest Code, a National Integrated Protected Area System Act, and an environmental code has been introduced to conserve the forest resources and address the problems of environmental degradation. Pursuant to the MPFD, approximately 1 million hectares of residual log over forest has been targeted for management under the Community Forestry Program over the next 25 years. This program aims to involve local communities in the management of the forest resource and to encourage the large companies to focus more on processing of the products and produced by the community projects. In the year 1992, a complete ban on the logging of the remaining old-growth forest has introduced. From that date, all timber production was to shift to residual forest areas. Concurrent with this ban, all old-growth forests, national parks, and other protected areas are to be placed under an integrated protected area system, or the IPAS, with the aim of preserving biodiversity and environmental values. Included in the IPAS management to ensure no exploitation or occupancy of the areas and the proposed management regime for buffer areas to the actual IPAS. Corporate sector involvement in the growing of industrial plantations is also encouraged through the Industrial Forest Plantation, or the IFP program. The government, having recognized the need for an ongoing supply for forest products, has accepted that this will have to increasingly come from plantations rather than the natural forest estate. This is not to suggest that the natural forest will not continue to be a major source of forest products, but the reality is that there is a need for intensive management of all forest resources to meet the substantial demand that exists. The IFP grants leases over large areas of denuded land for 25 years, renewable to 50 years, to private entities of minimal rates for the establishment of plantation. Investment cost can be written off as expenses. Forest charges are levied on timber harvest at rates much lower than those prevailing on harvest from natural forest plantations. Produce can be exported in raw or processed form, whereas produce from natural forest can only be exported in a processed form. Rattan is a given special consideration in the development of forest policy due to its importance as an export earner and the importance to rural people. Rattan furniture accounts for about 30% of export earnings from the forest industry. Policies gives priority to tribal communities in awarding of the rattan gathering permits. The philosophy behind this is to increase the returns to the tribal communities by pursuing the rattan using factories to negotiate directly with the tribal gatherers rather than a series of middlemen. The desired outcome of this process is higher returns to the tribal people, who in turn will value the rattan higher and thus will have a direct financial incentive. Sustainable management of the resource. In addition to this approach, there are now mechanisms in place to assist tribal groups to become a rattan processors in their own right. The summary of the Philippines history in recent times, the most significant change has been the end of martial law and the election of a democratic government, while problems such as graft and corruption do not instantly disappear. there has been progress in this area. These flaws throughout the forest policy area in that government reforms are more likely to be implemented. The thrust of the policy reforms has been to first, to involve the people affected by the decisions in the decision making process to a much greater extent. Second, address the processing problem of land and forest resources tenure by giving certainty of tenure resource users are encouraged to manage the resources in a sustainable manner with the knowledge that what they do will impact on their own future. Third, provide encouragement and assistance for community-based development of forest resources while at the same time ensuring that there is a place for the large companies which can provide the necessary capital and protect the remaining virgin forest areas and provide greater protection to remaining residual forest areas for long-term wood production. The last, encourage the development of plantations to supply future wood needs. This encouragement includes tax incentives and exemptions from export restrictions. And that's all. Thank you.